Once again, thank you for joining us for today for Dr. Gregory Cajete's talk, Native Science, Natural Laws of Interdependence. This talk will revolve around the question, what is native science and why is it important to consider in a world of climate change? Today's talk is sponsored by the Office of Native American Initiatives in the Office of the Provost and RII's Office of Societal Impact. I respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is a guest on the homelands of the Tohono O'odham and Pascua Yaqui. We respectfully acknowledge that the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of Indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign native nations and Indigenous communities through educational offerings, partnerships, and community service. We honor the sacredness of this land and recognize the sacrifices and suffering others experience that allow us to utilize this space now. One of the things that I love about this desert land is, although others believe that it's an unforgiving landscape, it sprouts life. It sprouts life for animals, plants, and people. I know our speaker's talk will inspire us to think more about how precious this land is. Please meet our speaker, Dr. Gregory Cajete. Dr. Cajete is a Native American educator whose work is dedicated to honoring the foundations of Indigenous knowledge in education. Dr. Cajete is Tewa from the Santa Clara Pueblo community in New Mexico. He worked at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe, New Mexico for 21 years. While at the Institute, he served as the Dean of the Center of Research for Research and Cultural Exchange, Chair of Native American Studies, and Professor of Ethnoscience. He is the former Director of Native American Studies and an Emeritus Professor in the Division of Language, Literacy, and Sociocultural Studies in the College of Education at the University of New Mexico. Quite impressive. Dr. Cajete has lectured at numerous colleges and universities around the world, has authored 10 books, has written chapters in 37 other books, along with numerous articles, and has given over 300 national and international presentations. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Gregory Cajete to the University of Arizona.
Sengeherinde, as we say in my language, Tewa, which means good morning to all of you. It's really a pleasure, to have this opportunity to share some thoughts and perspectives with you about native science. I have been to the University of Arizona on numerous occasions, over my career, and I think it was about 3 or 4 years ago, but it was before COVID time that I visited the university, usually during the hottest part of the year in the summer, when it's just, but in any case, it's always a pleasure to be here and to share some thoughts and perspectives with you. I'm going to kind of do this in a reverse fashion than I usually do. I'm going to sort of give you the punchline and then go into answering the question, why and what is native science? First of all, I have to say that I've been working really around this topic, I'm going to say for 48 years, if you include my college days, it comes out to about 52 years. Because I started it really as a research project while I was studying to be a biologist at the Highlands University, which is in Las Vegas, New Mexico Highlands University. And so it was there that I was training to be a biologist. And I became interested basically in indigenous knowledge, perspectives of indigenous people with regard to what we today call science. And so that started me really beginning to be very interested in answering this question, what is native science? And so over this long period of time, 50 years plus, I've been exploring the question, what is Native science? And it's a long journey. I don't, I couldn't imagine that it would spend 50 years, in this realm. In the early days, what I called Native science today was often called folk knowledge. It was also called ethnoscience. It was also called and has been called traditional ecological knowledge. So there have been various terms over the years, with regard to how this body of knowledge has been termed. I use the term Native science because science, the meaning of science actually, or the root definition of science is knowledge. So it's really native knowledge, but I use science. Sometimes just to piss off my science colleagues who don't believe that there is a native science, but I'll get to that in just a few minutes. But in any case, I call it native science, but there are many terms that you can use for this. Why has it become very important in today's world? Well, as I said, 50 years ago, people didn't even know what I would be referring to, when I said native science. I remember when I was teaching at the Institute of American Indian Arts and my students were working, on projects related to native knowledge from their tribes. We went to a Bureau of Indian Affairs science fair, and it was held in Albuquerque. And so the students prepared their projects, and there were different kinds of things that they were doing. And because they were artists, they were also representing some of these ideas in art forms. And so we went all out and, traveled down to Albuquerque in the van. And nobody came to our workshop. No, absolutely nobody came to our workshop. No one knew what we called it Indian biology at that time. And because no one knew what that was, that was how obscure in the context of at least academe, at least in terms of mainstream education, that's how obscure, this body of knowledge was. So it's really amazing to see that over a period of 50 years, it has now become very much a part of the discourse in a lot of different areas in academia, not only in science, but also in many other areas. And also with the rise of what we call sustainability science, there has been renewed interest in trying to understand the ways in which Native peoples around the world actually have utilized their knowledge and understandings and relationships with the places that they've lived to maintain and to sustain themselves through time and through generations. And so essentially, Native science is the earliest form of human sustainability science. Because every culture of the world had its form of native science, which allowed it to maintain and sustain itself in different kinds of environments and places all over the world. So the study of native science actually becomes very, very important in today's world because it forms a foundation, a historical foundation for possible strategies that can be used now to adapt to climate change. I believe, unfortunately, that we're past the point, we're past midnight hour, and we're really at the point where we have to begin to find ways to adapt to climate change because it's here. The process is well underway, and you can see that just by turning on the news, the nightly news, and seeing where in the world something extreme is happening in terms of climate change. Now, for Native people particularly, this is important because we have, yes, this tradition of Native science, but a lot of what has happened over the last 50 years is that in many cases, Native people are restoring, revitalizing, and relearning their forms of Native science because not only is it important in terms of cultural revitalization, which is also a movement that has paralleled the development of native science. is because it is important for Native people not only to understand where they have come from, but to understand how they may use that knowledge in new ways, new and productive ways, combining it, let's say, with Western science in ways that allow them to maintain and sustain themselves into the future. So it becomes very important for indigenous peoples around the world as they begin to reclaim and rename and revitalize, this ancient knowledge system. And it's important for modern people to really begin to take notice that there have always been knowledge systems, indigenous knowledge systems around the world, some of which have survived into these times, into these very extreme days of climate change, as it comes upon us. And I think that's the important point I want to make in terms of the whole presentation, that this is why Native science becomes now relevant. I was told many things when I was doing research in Native science, in the early days, like, what is Indian biology? That was one of the first wake-up calls. My students, had this wonderful presentation. We just laughed it off, but there was kind of an irony in that we knew what Native science was or what Native biology was, but no one else did. And so that's probably one of the reasons why no one really attended that session that we had. So it's coming into its own. There's more and more research being done all over the world, particularly as indigenous peoples all over the world begin to engage in the same project of revitalization, restoration of their traditional knowledge, and particularly as they become very active in restoring their lands or restoring some aspects of their ecologies that have been lost as a result of not only climate change, but also a lot of other kinds of things, issues like colonization. So it's a big project now. That's what I want to emphasize. It's gradually coming into mainstream academia. Okay, it's been around in biology circles, in circles related to ecology for a while, but it's now coming now into the mainstream thinking. A lot of research by both native and non-native scholars, around indigenous knowledge, around particularly ecological knowledge, what I call native science. So I just wanted to sort of bring that forward to really emphasize why, it's important today. And so I'm going to get right into my presentation. And talk a little bit about, I also use the term indigenous science. When I use indigenous science, I'm referring to the global perspective, okay? When I use native science, I'm more particularly focused here in North America, Mexico, South America. So that's the difference, okay? But as you see, we'll begin to sort of explore this question. There is a philosophy that is held in common, that's based on the indigenous worldview, which is also held in common by indigenous people, while there are different ways in which they have expressed that worldview, given their cultural ways. It's pretty much a common denominator among indigenous people, in that they know that the worldview is essentially based on a philosophy, or an epistemology is probably the better term to use, of coming to know the world through relationship. So it's a relational worldview that looks at the world as a tapestry of relationships, interdependent relationships between humans, between plants and animals, and everything within a place. Okay, so one can also call native science a place-based science, because it's very specifically evolved and sort of geared to living and maintaining and sustaining oneself in a place, okay? So again, lots of research being done in all of these areas. what also is very common in terms of Native philosophies is this idea of a spiritual orientation. This idea that everything is interacting continuously and that there's a dynamic harmony. So we're getting into metaphysics now in terms of how the world operates and how it moves. Lots of parallels. I had a long layover at the Phoenix airport, so I had a chance to read up on Taoism and Taoistic philosophy. And of course, there probably was a time when those two philosophies were connected in some way. I'm talking about 10, 15, maybe even 20,000 years ago, because there's so many parallels between Taoism and native thought. So if you want to sort of get into that, the comparison of indigenous thought, Taoism is really an amazing place to go, because a lot of what native people are talking about is also in the Taoistic texts. But this idea of interrelationship, interdependence, the idea of sustaining oneself, developing the human being in relationship, not only to other human beings, but also to everything that is around you, becomes a major theme in native science. And one of the goals actually of achieving this relationship, you know, in its deepest way, deepest level. So that dynamic multidimensional harmony is in a perpetual state of the universe, very much understanding that there is a process that we are a part of as human beings. All knowledge is related to the creation of the world and the emergence of man. So Native people have a lot of emergence stories that talk about, in a metaphoric way, in a very cultural way, how humans came to be and how we came to know and understand our relationships that are important to sustain our life, this life of our community, the life of the places in which we live. So, so this is also why native science becomes important at a philosophical level, not just in terms of a body of knowledge, but it's also at a philosophical level, because one of the biggest issues, one of the biggest debates in science today has to do with the materialistic philosophy upon which science is based. And the perception of not only indigenous scholars, but many other scholars around the world, that we have to begin to change that philosophy, that way of looking at the world. And we have to begin to expand that in order to begin to develop the kinds of strategies that we need in order to sustain and survive into the next generations. And so it becomes a very poignant philosophical question and philosophical debate. And this is going, again, all over the world, particularly as indigenous scholars and indigenous people participate in these conversations. So everything is alive, everything is animate and has a spirit. There is a significance to each natural place because each place reflects the whole order of nature. And the history of relationship must be respected with regard to places, plants, animals, and natural phenomena. So in order to understand indigenous cultures, indigenous ways of knowing, it's essential for us to really begin to look at the indigenous philosophies that are behind them. Okay, good. Native science philosophy continued. Technology should be appropriate and reflect balanced relationships to the natural world. So the philosophy guides how you use science. The philosophy that guides you, the worldview that guides the philosophy that guides the use of knowledge becomes a very important point. So technology should be appropriate and reflect balanced relationships to the natural world. There are basic relationships, patterns, and cycles in the world that need to be understood, and this is the proper role of mathematics. There are stages of initiation to knowledge. Elders are relied upon as keepers of essential knowledge. Acting in the world must be sanctioned through ritual and ceremony. Properly fashioned artifacts contain the energy of the thoughts, the materials, and the contexts in which they are fashioned. Therefore, they become symbols of those thoughts, those entities, and those processes. And even dreams are considered as gateways to possible creative possibilities if used wisely and practically. So again, when you get into looking at the in depth at Native science, you begin to see that it has these characteristics. And it's predicated on really a much more deepened consciousness of the notion of relationship and what that really means at all its levels. So the word science, as I said before, is the Greek word for knowledge. In this perspective, science is used in terms of the most inclusive meanings, that is as a story of the world and a practice way of living in it. So science can be looked at, in that way as well, as a way of understanding the story of humankind in the world. Native science is used as a metaphor for native knowledge and its creative participation with the natural world in both theory and practice. So, as you begin to look and again, I'm doing a lot of translation between native language and languaging and Western language and Western science thought, because that is required, in this context, to be able to understand that this is a kind of science, but it's coming from a different worldview, and it has a different kind of intent in terms of really establishing this consciousness, I guess you might say, of a relationship that is very deep and abiding, and actually has consequences if it's violated. And so all of those kinds of things, come into the conversation as you talk about native science. So, when I wrote this essay years ago, what I wanted to do was really to celebrate and acknowledge native contributions to this evolving world of the philosophy of science, as we begin to explore not only indigenous, contexts of thought, but also explore why it's important to begin to understand other ways of knowing the world, to bring that into the conversation as a valid and as a equal partner, if you will, in this conversation. And this is what indigenous people are also advocating all over the world, that their knowledge systems, their understandings of the world are valid. They are now very important to understand what we are going to do in the face in terms of strategies for dealing with climate change adaptation. So as we move forward, we have to begin to really think about these kinds of questions. The idea of religion, comes into play, but Native people have a different concept of religion. Religion is not the organized, institutionalized entity, but it's the way you are in the world, the way you live in the world. And it involves a very deeper level of that spiritual connection that we all have, that what we call in biology the biophilic connection, which is our natural instinct to affiliate with other human beings. It's also a natural instinct that we have within us to affiliate with other living things. And so that's the biophilic, instinct. And we all have it, we all express it in different kinds of ways. And so, as I say there, the essence of Native spirituality is not a religion as it's understood in the Western term, but rather a set of core beliefs about living in the world, about relationship in the world, and especially relationship to the natural world. So what I want to emphasize is that this is a different creative journey. It's a different way of understanding knowledge and understanding what knowledge is used for. It is coming from a different worldview. And certainly those worldviews have been in conflict At one time, the indigenous worldview was the human worldview. Okay, actually, it's the Western worldview that's the new kid on the block, very new. Actually, if you look at histories of cultures and histories of traditions around the world, it is the Western scientific worldview that is the new kid on the block. Okay, actually, the adolescent, one would say what's the term? Is it? It's the preteen stage, you know. So that should get some reaction, I think. So, you know, we are active participants. That's another important point is that Native science emphasized that we are all active participants in the world that we live in the relationships that we have, that there's no such thing as a free ride, that there are consequences for all one's actions, and that we affect not only each other, but we affect everything around us. And so this body of knowledge that I call Native science is also about ethical value, about core beliefs, about how you act in the world, how you behave in the world. And it gives you insight into why that's important, why that's an important consideration for every human being. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding also, because, you know, Native people, we have a lot of ceremonies and rituals that are performed that are private, you know, they're very specific to our tribes. But I think that many times they're misunderstood in the sense that these are occasions that we come together to remember not only who we are as a people, but also to remember what's important in some of these ideas, these values, these core beliefs that have been perpetuated generation after generation, become very important lessons. And the use of ceremony is an occasion, a context in which we remember why that's important. So I think that's very important to understand that has a place and that is an important consideration. So Native science reflects the unfolding story of a creative universe in which human beings are active and creative participants. When viewed from this perspective, science is evolutionary. Its expression unfolds through the general scheme of creative process of first insight, immersion, creation, and reflection. Native science is a reflection of the metaphoric mind, which is the older human mind, and from where native languages also come. And so, so we use language in a lot of different kinds of ways to express these kind of deeper understandings. That's why, again, you know, tribes today, one of the major you know, activities is restoration of indigenous languages, because that's what contains a lot of what I'm telling you about. And I'm talking for that tribe or for that people. The language becomes the coded metaphoric, you know, system in which this knowledge gets translated and transferred. So again, I finally come to the question, what is Native science? Okay, and I'm going to read this. In order to address this question, it's first important to define the boundaries of Native science. In reality, Native science is a broad and inclusive term that can include categories such as metaphysics and philosophy, art and architecture, practical technologies and agriculture, ritual and ceremony practiced by indigenous people, both past and present. More specifically, Native science encompasses such areas as astronomy, farming, plant domestication, plant medicine, animal husbandry, hunting, fishing, metallurgy, geology, and an array of other studies related to plants, animals, and natural phenomena. Yet native science extends beyond even these areas to include spirituality, community, creativity, and appropriate technologies which sustain environments and support essential aspects of human life. So it's in a way, it's an all-encompassing term that includes all of these different facets. So it has many facets to it. It's not just one thing, okay? And in those many facets, you have to also understand that everything is connected like a spider's web. It would be a good example. Everything is connected to everything else in that context. And so you can't just learn, let's say, astronomy, native astronomy, because if you learn native astronomy, all the other things come into play. You can't just learn about one thing without learning about many of the other things that it's connected to. So it's a holistic way of viewing and understanding the world as well. Now remember, in this conversation that we're having, that I'm also a Western trained biologist. I'm also a Western trained educator. And so that means I'm very familiar with the Western worldview and how it operates in the world. But simultaneously, like many Native people, I'm also very aware of my own, culture and my own language and traditions and all of the things that means. And so a lot of what I've been doing, even in my professional career, has been comparing and contrasting those two worlds, because I do live in both worlds, and that's true of almost every Indigenous person I know, that's living today, that there is that idea of living in two completely different worldviews. And being able to do that is a special skill, I have to tell you. It's not something that is easily done, but it's also a special skill, very creative skill. So, so the debate goes on, in terms of why, native science is important. In native languages, there's really no word for science. There's no word for art, but they're definitely there. There's no word for psychology or philosophy, but it's really understanding that all of these philosophies or ologies, are pathways, into the same realm, that they're connected to each other in many different kinds of ways. So coming to know and understand the nature of life and our relationships therein would be the best way to describe what Indigenous knowledge is, what Indigenous education is at a historic and traditional level. It's coming to knowledge. It's a journey, which implies a journey, a pathway. Okay, so many times learning is described as a pathway in native languages, or a journey. So not having, more accurately, not needing a word for science, art, or psychology did not diminish its practice or importance in native life. For native people, seeking life was the encompassing task of their life, and every member of the tribe in their own time and through their own unique capacity was a scientist, an artist, a storyteller, a participant in this greater web of life, of community around them. And while there were tribal specialists with particular knowledge, technologies, and ritual understanding for specific cultural practices, societal needs, the creative spirit and focus on essential life-sustaining relationships guided the processes of native science. So it's a life-centered, life-seeking, life-oriented, life-begetting kind of process that native science is focused on. It goes back to that instinct of biophilia. It actually builds, it enhances and it enlivens and it deepens one's understanding of what that really means, that instinct really means, you know, in application, what it is to be related, in other words, to other life. So that's another metaphor that I think is really important because when you sort of shift your thinking, you know, to ask the question, how does this support my life, or whatever is happening, how does this support one's life or one's community life or life in the natural world, that sort of brings you into a different kind of thinking space. And that really begins to help you to understand these broader contexts of relationship and interdependence. And Western ecology, Western environmental science is getting there. It's a process. It is a Western science, but it's getting to some of these values and getting to some of these places that the indigenous people have been talking about for quite some time, this idea of life-centeredness and the support of life in all its variations. And so, you know, it's a coming to know process. It evolved over millennia of human experience with the natural world. That's another thing, is native science is deeply embedded in human evolution. It's deeply embedded. It's the result of our experiences of being human over all the time that we have been human. Okay, so that's an amazing repertoire of experience, you know, and that's what native science keys in on. And just for that reason, if nothing else, if you would believe nothing else, just for that reason, it is important, extremely important to study it. So, to gain a sense for the essence of native science, one must also participate in the natural world. To understand the foundations of native science, one must become open to the roles of sensation, perception, imagination, emotion, symbols, spirit, as well as concepts, logic, and rational empiricism. So it's bringing all of the human faculties into play. You see, there's a tendency in modern education, you know, to segment, to fragment, and to reduce knowledge to just a single point. And somehow you're supposed to connect that single point at a later time to everything else. Well, native science begins with understanding everything else before you get to the specific points. And that everything else includes all of your capacities, because we use only a very small portion of our capacities of being human, our perceptions, our imagination, you know, our ability to create things, and even the brain itself. We use still about 10% of its total capacity. And so indigenous science was intuitively aware of that, you see, and began to bring some of those other kinds of ways of human knowing into the mix of this knowledge. So much of the essence of native science is beyond words, literal description, indeed misapplied many times. Many may destroy the real and holistic experience of nature as direct participatory act around which native science has evolved. So at its deeper levels, it's difficult to describe in words. You actually have to begin to use symbols. You have to and this is where art comes in. You have to begin to art it, to represent it imaginatively, you know, to give a sense of it, but you can't really necessarily, in a lot of ways, rationally describe it, because it's more than just what language can handle in most cases. So you have poetry, you have storytelling, you have symbolic representation, you know, being used by all cultures of the world in order to describe something that is not necessarily describable. So, you know, that's an important point. So in literal terms of biology, native science may be seen, as I said, to reflect that biophilic natural instinct that we all have. And again, I think that one of the things that, I don't know if, yeah, because I'm also very involved with education, and I look at how education, today's education actually thwarts a lot of what I'm talking about in terms of, our innate ability to sense and to know and understand the world. And I remember a book reading The Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv, in which he describes in a very lamentable way, how over time, over generations, we've numbed, almost become autistic, with regard to our abilities to interact with the natural world as our ancestors once did. And so he laments that and really talks about how education itself, as it is practiced in modern contexts, actually negates some of those natural sensibilities so that it's difficult to come back to, and so he really is making a case for, interaction with the natural world to move beyond biophobia, which is a fear of nature, and to move into the realm of biophilia, which is a feeling of connection to the natural world, because he says that's essentially what's going to save us, ultimately, is our understanding that we are connected to the natural world in very intimate and very direct ways. So again, I just want to emphasize that this is a big conversation that many, many scientists, many philosophers, many educators around the world have written, have researched, and have really begun to explore, some of these realms that we're talking about. And I just want to really encourage you to start reading, some of that material if you haven't done so already. So I would call it a participatory science, and so it goes beyond the laboratory. It's about participating in the real world with real world issues, with all that you are as a human being. So, so that's why, it's important to begin to revisit why native science is important. Because as I say here, the dilemma of the today modern societies are wholly estranged from the natural world. Modern technology, the byproduct of modern science, cuts us off rather than connects us to the processes of the natural world, to the extent that many people grow to fear and distance themselves from the natural. Modern people grow up detached from the very ground of their biological being and become so accustomed to a technologically mediated interpretation of the world that they come to think that the world is the very technology which mediates their experience. It cut off from direct experience of and participation with the natural world. Modern peoples collectively suffer a kind of sensory emotional starvation, which at times reaches epidemic proportions and leads to many and various forms of acting out mind at the individual and collective levels. So there's a social psychology now coming into play, in terms of what happens. I know that one author compares it to humans becoming autistic, to natural world, to the natural experiences, and looks at the rise of autism, the rise of a variety of different kinds of psychosocial issues, that we deal with today in society. So again, you're looking at a lot of different kinds of ramifications, connections. So part of it, as now talking as an educator, is to first of all understand the situation, as it exists, and to try to begin to figure out ways to move beyond it, and to move back into this more participatory consciousness, with regard to nature and education. So So I'll finish with this, and I'll just simply state, I remember trying to find, when I was doing my research for my dissertation and doing the work that I had done at the IAIA Institute of American Indian Arts with my students, when we were exploring these questions that became Native Science, the book Native Science. That incidentally is the content that we were exploring. What you're reading in Native Science is the content that we were exploring as high school and first and second year college students, as they took my classes. As I'm thinking about it, part of this issue, has been around for a long time, but in Native circles, there was really nothing really written about it. You had to go through anthropology, writing, or you had to go through some cases sociology or mythology, but it wasn't written. I ran across a Polish philosopher. His name is Heinrich Schliemann. And this is a direct quote from some of his work. The modern mind has lost its sensate beings, its orientation to its roots and to the natural world of processes of which it is a part. To address this perceptual blindness, a new science must be developed that includes at its very core the reintroduction of the participatory mind. It must once again become a mind that cyclically renews its orientation to the primal world of life and living processes. It must be a mind which recalls and reestablishes the basis of human awareness in the larger ecology of the world. Science as a whole must once again become the story of this awareness and this relationship to the animate world. And language must once again be understood as body-based vehicles for referring to animate landscapes, which first gave rise to its expression. The thoughts which guide our actions and comprise our contemplation must be understood as a part of dynamic expression of the physical as well as the metaphorical air which animates all nature. So, and that was written in the 1970s. Okay, by Heinrich Schliemann. So this question is not only a question that I've been exploring, it's a question that has been explored by many scholars. And so, what he talks about essentially is that there is an intelligence, that developing the ecological and participatory mind, as he calls it, as he advocates, that this is essential for the development of science now and into the future. And that unless we do that, and unless we begin to really take this seriously, and essentially change our minds, we are probably not going to be able to solve many of the issues that are before us because of their complexity and because we're only using such a small part of our capacity. So, in answering that last question, what is Native Science? That just gives you an idea of some of the thoughts and perspectives that are contained in Native Science. And of course I could go on because I'm a professor and I can talk forever, but we don't have forever. So again, I've been referring to Native Science. This was out of print for a while, then I argued with the publisher and he put some more out, and I'm not sure if there's still copies available, but I'm sure if you have ingenuity, you'll find a way to find a copy if you want one of Native Science. But it is available on Amazon, sometimes for outrageous prices. But in any case, I do recommend, if you haven't read it already, to read Native Science. And also my dissertation, which was written in 1986, but the work was done in 1974, Igniting the Sparkle, which is what I worked and how I did and how I applied Native Science in a Western science class at the Institute of American Indian Arts in Santa Fe. So with that, I hope I've given you some insights into Native Science. There's much more. As I said, I could talk much longer, but I think you've got the idea. And you have an understanding that there's something very important that really needs to be expressed and explored. I should not only expressed, but explored. And that is what I call Native science. So thank you.
So we'll take some questions and I'll go around with the, I realize I didn't introduce myself. My name is Teresa Cortez. I'm the CAL's ASEMS, and ASEMS is Arizona Science, Engineering, and Math Scholars Program, the program specialist, and I work with first year, as well as the Bridge to STEAM liaison, which is putting on this event today. So questions, if you can raise your hand and I'll hand you the mic. Don't be shy. Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And if you could introduce yourself.
I'm Rebecca. I was wondering, you said that in order to adapt to this new climate change and the changing of the environment, we need to apply Native science to Western science. So how do you think that we can do that?
Well, it's really a matter of a kind of consciousness that is inclusive of other ways of knowing, and really beginning to appreciate and respect that and to incorporate that into the teaching and learning of science at every level. I have to say that it's already happening in a lot of different kinds of ways in lots of different schools that are progressive. But we also have to face the fact that education has also been one of the causes why people have lost a lot of this knowledge and understanding, or don't respect it, or don't consider it important. But I think it's really a changing of consciousness that is required, and that's going on already. I think a lot of young people today, are searching for, answers outside the box, so to speak, and are really looking at, becoming their own researchers and beginning to look at this question, what are the possibilities of bringing other forms of knowledge, other perspectives into the conversation. And that's also happening within, the mainstream universities as well. But I think that it's going to take kind of a holistic kind of reorientation of the way that we think about what science is, and the way that we think about how to address, the many issues that are very specifically, very holistically systemic that are facing us, with regard to climate change and all of the kind of impacts that it's having on us societally, economically, culturally. So, so I have to say that this is a part of the conversation already, and I'm saying that we need to augment it. We need to begin to become the advocate for that kind of thinking, that kind of reflection, and that's the way the minds will begin to change, or at least consider this Native knowledge, this Native perspective. All people have Native knowledge. You have to say we have innate personal knowledge just based on our life experiences, and different cultures, different places, have evolved that knowledge in ways over generations that has allowed them to survive in the places in which we live, and so we have to begin to consider a lot of different kinds of strategies that are outside the box. And I think that process is very well understood as being a process that we need to really begin to engage in, especially in higher education. But institutions don't change very fast. It's really the individuals, students, that make the changes. that push the envelope, so to speak. And that's certainly happening as well among many students. So.
Thank you, Dr. Cajete. We do have a couple questions in the chat, and I'll read one from Laurel Collier. I was curious about that concept of that author you mentioned that believes we are becoming autistic to the natural world. What does he mean by that? I am the mom of a 24-year-old autistic daughter, and I find that sometimes I wish others could see the natural world through her eyes.
Yeah, I'm using that as a metaphor for actually, I know that many autistic children are very perceptive to the natural world. And so I'm not necessarily using it in exactly those terms. What I'm saying is that, you know, we moderns have because of our experience and because of living in the modern world, have almost become deaf, you know, and so that we don't see nature as, we see nature as only superficial, in superficial ways, as non-existent. We don't really have a connection to nature. We're in some cases afraid of nature. And that's another kind of there's a whole possibility that we have before us is being negated, you know. And that's what I meant, but I know that a lot of autistic children are amazingly perceptive, amazingly imaginative, and they have they haven't lost in some cases that deep abiding human connection to other living things, you know. So I acknowledge that, you know, but again, I'm using it as a way to describe, or to be dramatic. Let's put it that way. I'm being dramatic with the way I'm describing how we view nature. Yes.
First of all, thank you for the good presentation. My name is Aminta Manhibar. I'm a PhD student in American Indian Studies. So what you've said really fits into what I'm learning. But what I'm learning about right now is really the destructiveness of the capitalist system that we have in the world right now.
Yeah.
And all over the world, we see indigenous peoples fighting to protect their territories and their knowledge.
Yes.
But I want to ask you, how can we as scholars and academics and also general members of society use this knowledge, this native or indigenous science to fight back, to find a way to bring sustainability to our lives?
Well, you know, I think that, you know, one of the hallmarks of Native people has been their resilience against tremendous odds, you know, and the first thing that for indigenous people is really to learn or relearn, you know, their traditional forms of knowledge and their traditional ways of life and sustainability. That being said, in many cases, many indigenous people are no longer able to practice some of that because of land loss, because of culture loss, because of language loss. So there's a whole process of regaining that and reestablishing that, learning from that. And once that begins simultaneously to that, you begin to think creatively of how to apply some of that knowledge, that understanding, that philosophy, those ethics into a modern context. And so it's a kind of dual approach, you know, one to relearn, secondly, to reapply in your context or in the larger context of, let's say, in academia. And so a lot of indigenous scholars are actually doing exactly that today, especially at the PhD level. Yeah, and it's a simultaneous process. You're learning while you're doing. You see, it's not, you know, learn this and then go to there. It's learning while you're doing, which also it actually is a very indigenous concept as well. You learn by doing and by applying. And so that's what you see a lot of indigenous people doing, because what they are protecting is this way of life, this consciousness, ultimately, and because it's a life-centered concept. It's generation after generation been proven that this supports life rather than destroys it. And so it's convincing, and it's also incorporating and it's also exemplifying this in the modern world that's going to make the difference. And that's what Indigenous people are fighting for as well. Particularly at this level of scholars. The scholars are like the forefront, you know, of that movement. And so you have to take that responsibility. That's an important role that you play. But it's doing everything at the same time. And sometimes that's very difficult, I know. Hopefully that answers your question. Yes.
What a wonderful place to end. Our time together has ended. This video will be available through the
NAIIR website. That's the Native American Advancement Initiatives and Research website.
right. So again, let's give Dr. Gregory Cajete a round of applause, both virtually and in person.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
And Bridge to STEAM, by the way, is a partnership with Diné College on the Navajo Nation. So if you have people in your lives that are affiliated with Diné College, definitely have them check out Bridge to STEAM. So thank you very much. Have a great day.